person landing from outer space understand about reality and reading this article?
Well, if the person from outer space knew the facts, they would assume they'd landed in Stalinist Russia, in a totalitarian state. Because the author of that, there's a long article, big inside page and so on, and I think that, if I remember correctly, the phrase you read is the only reference to the U.S. role in the coup. The U.S. government decided, certainly, actually the U.S. been undermining elections in Chile for years, in 1964 and so on. By 1970, they committed themselves to overthrowing the Allende government. And there were two tracks. There was a hard track, which would lead to a military coup, and there was a soft track, which was make the economy scream. So the U.S. engaged directly and extensively with the Chilean upper classes in ensuring that the economy had exactly the characteristics you described. Yes, they made the economy scream. They were also involved with coup planning and so on. So it's just one of a series of coups that the U.S. either instigated or supported or directly participated in through the 60s, 70s, leading up finally to the terrorist war in Central America. There's a period of play of repression throughout the continent. Actually, this particular case happens to be slightly poignant. Personally, I came back from Chile a couple of weeks ago, and the most accurate statement I saw about it was by Ariel Dorfman, also in the Times today, in which he says this is a society full of fear. That's correct. It's 17 years of democracy, and you can feel the fear that remains. I was taken through Grimaldi, which is one of the worst of Pinochet's torture chambers. I was taken through it by a man who's now a well-known international lawyer or professor, human rights activist, who was tortured there. He went through the whole torture period. He said that he took a friend of his and me and a couple other people through and went through it step by step. Here's what they did to this kind of torture and that kind of torture and so on. And it was, he said it was years before he even talked about it. I mean, the torture was hideous. We also had one man who was the lone survivor of the sort of death chamber, which was at the end of the torture. After you've been through it all, if they decide they don't want you anymore, they put you in a horrifying death chamber, and this one person somehow survived. So he was, but at one point in the tortures were horrifying. He described in detail. The tortures were all supervised by doctors, and their role is to ensure that the person who's being tortured doesn't die, because they have to be kept alive for the next stage of torture. And so they would, tell them to stop and administer something to bring them back to life and so on, so they could be tortured more. I asked him at one point, well, where are those doctors? I said, they're practicing in Santiago. And nobody would think of doing anything about it. In fact, people even go to it. It's like having Mengele walking around the street. And that's one aspect of what you see, just fear. I mean, it reminds me of, there was I may have talked about this, there was a conference run by the Jesuits in El Salvador in 1994, after the terror had ended. This is the ones who survived, a lot of them didn't. And the theme of the conference was what they called the culture of terror that remains after the terror is over. And they said that what remains is a pervasive culture of terror which domesticates the aspirations of the population. You don't even hope anymore, and it just remains that way. Friends in Chile had talked to me about this. It was a very lively, exciting country. People were just isolated. They didn't trust each other. Didn't want to do anything. The doctors is a particularly kind of grisly case, but there are others. Like one of the things this same article, in fact every article, mentions is that, well, Pinochet, not a very nice guy, but he left this fantastic economy, guided by the Chicago boys, and so it's a booming economy. Well, the fact of the matter, which they know, and if you read carefully, you'll notice a phrase referring to it, is that the Chicago boys did run the economy under terror, so they could impose straight Chicago doctrine with the torture going on. Nobody could do anything about it, and they drove the country into probably the worst depression in its history. 1982, the state had to intervene bailed out the private economy. And in fact, the state controlled more of the economy than under Allende. One international economist, David Felix, called it the Chicago Road to Socialism. Then after that, they sort of handed it over to civilians, and they kind of slowly got out of the mess. But the whole Pinochet period was still a disaster. And in fact, what they don't point out also is that the reason Chile has an export economy, primary product exports is the main source of income, and the main one is copper. And that includes the world's major copper producer, Codelco, which happens to be state-owned, was nationalized by Allende. And that's the biggest copper producer in the world. It's very efficient. So the dictatorship cut away at its scaled it down. They couldn't eliminate it, too much support for it. The economy depends on it. They finally, and the Concertación, the democratic government that followed it, has also cut it down. So it's now not the majority producer, though it's still the biggest single producer. However, another fact that they don't mention here is that not only is this booming capitalist economy based considerably on an efficient state-owned industry, there are many other violations, but that industry, Codelco, provides probably state revenues at a level probably 10 times as high as the private companies, which finances the state's welfare programs to the extent that they exist. They're not very good, and so on. All of this is missing, plus the straight horror of it, plus, of course, the U.S. role. And what Dorfman said is right. The country is full of fear. You can sense it years after the dictatorship.
Another characteristic of this kind of writing is the use of the passive voice. Talk about that.
Yeah, so people were killed, not we killed them, that sort of thing. Yeah, that's a standard device. Or they died, you know, just like a hurricane came. Not we murdered them, you know, we tortured them. You know. In fact, there's more that you can say about the Chilean coup. That was, as they point out, on September 11th, 1973, which is often called the first 9/11 in South America. And if you want to really think of what it was like, let's take a look at our 9/11 and imagine that it was on the same scale as 9/11, 1973, the one we were instrumental in perpetrating. Well, to make a sensible analogy, you have to use per capita equivalent numbers because it's a much bigger country. So let's imagine that in December 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda had bombed the White House, killed the president, instituted a military coup, killed 50 to 100,000 people, tortured 700,000, established a terror center in Washington, which instigated or supported comparable military coups elsewhere in the hemisphere.